right. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I would like to welcome all of you to this second installment of our conservation workshop that we began about 2 weeks ago. My name is Phumelele Duma, and I will be the facilitator of today's proceeding, and I'm a senior postdoctoral fellow with the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation with the University of Johannesburg. So about 2 weeks ago, we had the first installment of this workshop series where we were looking at fracking. This is the workshop series that we are doing in collaboration with the Leadership for Conservation in Africa. And the main idea behind it is to conscientize the non-conservation students about the importance and significance of protecting the environment. So we had a group of experts, very esteemed panelists here with us, that gave us the critical legal and environmental perspectives on hydraulic fracturing in the Karoo. And as you may have seen already on the program and the poster that was shared with all of you here, I believe, today we are looking at the complexities of environmental conservation. And of course, we have another very well-esteemed panelist that are going to take us through that. So maybe just before we start and I introduce the first speaker, there are just a couple of announcements and requests that I'd like to make to each and every one of you. Again, the program and the poster that was shared with you, it has two links, the program. So there's the one that is titled Pre-Evaluation Assessment, which if you have not done, I'd like to request you to quickly complete that one, as we are supposed to do that before we begin the workshop for today. And then there's the one that is titled Post-Evaluation Form, which we will do after the conversation of today. So I'd like to quickly request that as we are shortly about to begin, that you just quickly complete that first one before we start for today. While we are doing that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker for the day, who is Professor Wendy Forden. Professor Forden is an extraordinary associate professor and a nature conservation scientist affiliated with Stellenbosch University. Professor Forden focuses on providing scientifically robust and pragmatic support for biodiversity conservation in the face of climate change. She's a senior researcher at the University of Stellenbosch and chairs the CNSSC Climate Change Specialist Group. So nature, people, and science are what gets Dr. Forden out of bed in the morning. So there's about 20 minutes time allocation that we have for each speaker today. And I believe Dr. Forden would like to begin with some brainstorming and a group discussion around her presentation. So I'd like to welcome her on stage to give us her presentation. But before you start, Dr. Forden, Professor Forden, I'd like to invite the speakers to come to this side. Please come up this side, please.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here to talk to all of you. I'm really excited when we get to do cross-disciplinary communication and really start to share in each other's worlds. I think particularly at university level, we'll end up really going down wormholes of specialization, and it's great to look into each other's fields and realize how much overlap there is. So I'm not sure if you can pop my presentation on the screen. So you've heard a little bit about me working with nature particularly. And before I start talking much, thank you, I wanted to ask you to have a think and ask a question of you. Here's my clicker. That's a little bit about me. So when I was a student, that's what I looked like. I was out in the field measuring trees and working on climate change. And now I do a much sort of broader, bigger picture stuff than that, although I still get to go in the field. But I'd like you guys to please turn to the person next to you, ideally in twos, but if you have any left out people, then go into threes. So pick a partner. Anybody not got a partner? Okay. So what I would like you to do is choose a number, a number 1 and a number 2 within your group. And answer this question. Firstly, what does nature mean to you? What is nature? And the same person asks the question, what just happened? And how has nature impacted you? Okay. And I'm going to give you a minute for each of those questions. Firstly, person number 1 speaks. Person number 2 listens. So it's not a conversation. It's person number 1 speaking. And then I'll tell you when to switch over, and then person number 2 tells the other way. Okay. Go ahead. Okay. So would anybody like to suggest what's some of the responses, some of the things you were feeling about what nature means to you? Just words. Send me some words. Speakers, any words about what nature means to you personally?
Me personally.
Yeah. Okay. Something that's useful for your well-being. Okay. Yeah. Okay. You are nature. Okay. Beautiful. Beautiful and life and peaceful. Great. Anybody feel threatened by nature? So in what sense? How yeah, what does it what parts of nature threaten you or make you feel concerned? Animals. Okay, what kind of animals? Wild animals. Okay. So they're of concern. Okay.
I feel threatened by the unpredictability of climate and weather, and how that is natural but unnatural.
Okay. And we'll touch a little on climate change today. That's yeah. So uncertain and unpredictable. So a little bit concerned. Others who feel, yeah, go ahead.
We just do this because the ones online cannot hear us if we just speaking without mic. Yeah.
I also feel threatened by nature in terms of zoonotic diseases. So there's always this issue of diseases transferring from wild animals to human beings. So that's always an issue in conservation for me. But that doesn't stop me from appreciating nature.
Great. Yeah, I mean, sometimes we watch things that are scary. You only need to watch all these spider programs and snake programs to know that things that are scary are fascinating, a little bit fascinating to us. I'm going to push on to there's 2 more questions that I would like you to answer. And this time I ask you to draw on the bits of nature that you do find, whether it's fascinating even because it's scary or because it's beautiful, to think about your favorite place in nature. And all of you walked through lawns and past trees. So, you know, you've experienced nature coming in here, but you also might be from a rural area, from a farm, or you might have had the privilege of going to a nature reserve or walking on Melville Koppies or something. Your contact with nature, where's your favorite place in nature? And how does it make you feel? Okay, so turn to the same people, same number 1 and number 2, and I'll tell you when to switch over on those 2 questions. Okay, so how does nature make you feel? You see, everybody sighs, huh? Ah, that's what it does, right? Yeah, so some words. I was hearing peaceful, calm, yeah, connected, serenity. Everything's gonna be okay. Yeah. Again? Now I heard somebody there. I feel really connected. I feel at ease. It's sort of like it's a heart, like my heart gets open somehow. Very soothing. Yeah. And I always feel welcome. I never feel like yeah, I just feel like, okay, I'm home. Yeah. So it's something really special. And it does give us all sorts of resources, but it also just has some inherent value that connects in with us, like Knowledge said. Somehow we are a part of it. And so it's hard to talk about nature because, I mean, it's a part of a science, but it's also something that's so emotionally important, socially important, culturally important. So nature conservation seems the domain largely of scientists, but I really want to stress that is just a strange legacy of the way that sort of society works, and it's really so much more than this. That's why I'm glad we're having this crossover. So I want to talk to you a little about how conservation, the field of conservation, actually came about, because I think everybody's always felt like we do, aside from if you're about to be eaten by a tiger or wherever you are. But even there, we find people on the boundaries of Kruger National Park still have pride in the elephants and in the rhinos. They still want them there. Obviously, it's not great when they've just trampled your crops, but there's still some pride. They're still our elephants, you know? So how did it come to be that we had these formal structures and ways of conserving nature? Oh, that's my timing. So it started out when, in the old days, nature was just so big. We were few people on the planet. Nature was so big, and there was an endless amount of resources. And we just felt like they were never going to run out. But then in the 1960s and early 70s, people started to realize, we're putting a lot of pesticides and pollution into the atmosphere. There was this work on this seminal work called The Silent Spring, where Rachel Carlson talked about putting these pesticides on plants and all the animals and birds will die and spring will come and there'll be no sun. And that was really the beginning of the environmentalist movement. So there became a growing consciousness in society that resources weren't endless and we actually had to start looking after them. And so that built until in 1992, the UN put together, after many years of preparation, it's called the Rio Convention. It was a convention on biological diversity with a whole lot of terms on how the world proposed to actually care about nature and to give nature rights. And one of the interesting things about that is it recognized the inherent value of nature. And pretty much all of the countries in the world, one by one, signed up and ratified that convention. So everybody agreed to do that, with the exception of the US. But that's partly because they had their own legislation and they don't like to be told what to do by anybody. And one other country also didn't sign up, and that was Bolivia. And they still to this day haven't signed up. And that's because they didn't, well, okay, that's more recently. One of the things that I guess it does have in common, that early phase of the convention, is that it recognized, as I said, the inherent value of species and nature, which is something in common with very many indigenous cultures and First Nations people around the world. That we're not separate from nature, that we're a part of it. Amongst the Native American people, for example, you're an entity, as is a rock, as is a tree, as is an animal. We're all the same. And they even take exception to the idea of humans managing biodiversity at all. It's almost like saying, I'm going to boss you around, but you never elected me to do so. We're all the same. I'm not an elected leader. How can I decide to take control and manage? Instead, I'll facilitate change. I'll help us all to converse and work together. But I'm not assuming I'm the boss. So it's really a very respectful way of working with nature. And I'm glad to say that after, I'll take you through some more steps, but there's a swing around back to recognizing the indigenous ways of working with nature and starting to respect them, which is great. Next came the recognition. People were like, no, you must recognize nature. And I were like, yeah, lovely, of course we do. But they just pushed it aside. It's like the arts. We'll give you a little bit of money, off you go. But it didn't really feel for much of decision-making in the world and inform the way that governments and people managed politics. And so then the conservationists were like, listen, don't you see how much nature gives us? Look, it gives us all of those different services that are so crucial for life on Earth. So listen, you really need to value nature. And so then that all caught on, and it was this idea of, you see, now we need to put a value on those services, because imagine you had to generate that water, that clean water, or you had to clean that air. You know how much it would cost you. So we're going to put a value on how much it would cost you. We all agree you can't buy it, and it's more money than that exists. But if we don't put a value on it, you're going to say it's naught. So let's try put a value on it. And so that came the next thing of like the Western world commoditizing, basically, that like putting a number on ecosystem services, and then trying to get business to take notice of it. And so they slowly did, and that built in. But it was a very Western business focused approach. So then came the recognition that you can put aside these pieces of land and kick people off, but that's never going to work. And of course, it's just not right. It's is unjust and violates so many different aspects of being human. And so then they swung in, probably in the late 80s, early 90s, a push towards really paying attention to the communities who are adjacent to, who are living on the land, who are already often conserving that land, and ensuring, since they're the ones that bear the cost of conservation, say they're the ones living next to Kruger Park and have the elephants come and squash their crops, that they must benefit. They need to be the beneficiaries. It's not just the rich tourists who go and enjoy their photo safari. And so it is a recognition of how to bring those benefits back to the people on the ground. And that remains a dominant paradigm. And our two other speakers, Prof. Walter and Knowledge, will both be speaking onto this subject as to how to make sure you don't just take the money, basically stepping into how to work with communities in a more effective way. And if you don't, obviously it's just not going to work. If you don't have buy-in of the people there, if they're not benefiting, it's not going to work anyway. And I'm glad to say that South Africa is just in the process of promulgating a brand new Biodiversity Act. And there's been it's been quite controversial. And a lot of people, so the main crux of this is to try and realize the value of biodiversity for the people of South Africa. And there's been a lot of criticism from the sort of the right group saying it's not right that you're trying to sell our wildlife and to commoditize it. But South Africa's taken the stance, often in contravention of the West and other places, to say, no, this wildlife belongs to the people. Let's use it for the people. They must get value. So things like trading and selling wildlife, setting communities up as small wildlife initiatives, using these natural resources, access and benefit sharing. They're all promoted and regulated by our Act. So I think we can be quite proud of South Africa in enabling this. Into it, they also have a fair few bits around animal welfare. So making sure that, for example, this canned lion hunting where farmers, people, you can just breed a lion and the next day a rich tourist comes and shoots it and you say, oh, well done, you shot a lion. It's just not right? So that's stopped. There are many good aspects about it. And one of the other things it pushes is really expanding the areas under protection. But these are not necessarily by putting a fence around and kicking people out. It's some of it around agreements with local landowners, community, tribal trusts to manage in a certain way, and then they get benefits. So you can see that we've really shifted quite a lot in the way we do conservation. And I'm proud of South Africa for what we've done. And lastly, this one sits on the horizon. We're just heading forward. It's more European than South African at this stage. And this is heading for net zero. So realizing, for example, around climate change, that we're trashing the environment. There are now way too many of us. And our impact of any business, of any industry, of creating your genes should be nothing on the planet. Not in terms of carbon and not in terms of biodiversity. And so everybody's striving to do that. And we'll end up with carbon trading as a process, for example, of being able to pay somebody to plant a tree that takes the carbon out the atmosphere and allows you to have zero impact. So that's where we're headed in terms of the commoditization is trying to get to zero. And they're in Europe, it's now heavily regulated and businesses have to do that. So we've come a long way. They can't ignore us anymore. yeah, it's really been quite mainstreamed in society and business. It's great. We have now 2022. We have a new. It's a lot of updates to the UN's the biodiversity convention, and a whole lot of new targets as to what we're actually trying to do by 2030. And there you can see them, 23 different targets to conserve, avoid degradation, safeguard what we have, and act. And I think those valuable bit on this here are those 4 overarching goals, which is really how you do conservation. And I could give you 10 lectures on what those, on how to actually make that happen. But the basics really are halting loss and restoring nature, using lands and seas sustainably, sharing benefits and services, so making sure everybody does benefits, and then mobilizing the resources, i.e. the money, to get everybody to buy in and do this. So yeah, halt loss, restore nature. That's a biggie, and that's what's the kind of traditional South African national parks, sort of what your kind of standard thing. Conservation agencies, that's what I spend a lot of my time doing. But yeah, it's embedded within a much bigger framework. So what are those threats that we're trying to address? And I tackle this really briefly. I'm just looking at our time. So we're talking obviously about pollution, about climate change. There's some bats that just on a hot night, this is in Australia, they just fell out of the trees. It's just straight physiological heat stress. And that's the stuff that humans go through too. We've had some of those die-offs in our birds in the Kalahari too. Yeah, coral reef bleaching. This is a summary of some of them grouped in, but and obviously underneath there are so many sort of nuances and interactions between all of those different threats. So a lot to address. I guess you guys heard about fracking in the last lecture. Yeah. Very briefly, to tackle climate change, just to show you what is going on in terms of climate change. This is the sort of the temperature and carbon dioxide levels of the last 800,000 years, taken from an ice core. And you can see, everybody says like climate has always been changing. So why are we worrying now? So you can see how they have always been changing. It's completely correct. There's the carbon dioxide changing. It's about 100,000 year cycles as the Earth goes in a non-circle around, in its orbit. But then what happened? Look where we are now. The latest is 424 parts per million. Do you see how far out of the usual that is? So to zoom in a bit closer, this is the last 2,000 years. So at the beginning, we've got the birth of Christ, and there's the birth of Muhammad. So you can see at the time of Christ, they were living in a climate that's now quite different from ours. And what happened? What happened there, right? That it suddenly shifted to being so weird. Well, the Industrial Revolution. And we thought we were being so clever when we took that coal out of the ground and the petrol and the oil and burnt it to make machines and make our lives so much easier. And we had no idea what was coming, right? We just didn't see this. So we didn't mean it to happen, but we didn't see it. And so that is what we're now dealing with. You guys probably know about the greenhouse effect, but just to remind you how it works, those gases, so from the coal and the gas, mostly carbon dioxide, sits there and is now like 1.5 times as thick as it used to be at the time of our great-grandparents. And so the sun that comes in gets trapped inside like a greenhouse and bounces around rather than reflecting out into space. And that's why we end up getting warmer. It's like you've taken a duvet and put like 1.5 tog on, and then obviously you're going to get hotter. It's quite obvious. And yeah, how do you do it? You got to take that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Somehow, trees do it, but there's not nearly enough space to actually take it all out. And besides, a lot of our landscapes are not meant to be trees. But the most important thing is just to stop taking it out of the ground and putting it up there. A lot of it gets absorbed by the ocean, and you've got that, but that takes 30 years, and you've got to just let that happen and not put more up. So that's why we're all trying to cut emissions. And that's where we've got to so far. This is not a projection. This is observed. This is what's actually already happened in terms of temperature. And you can see it's very much not even how the climate in the world warms. The land areas warm much more than the oceans. They're much more buffered. And the Arctic has a really rough ride. They're definitely, the melting sort of North Pole and the sea ice is so real. But look at us. We're not doing great ourselves. And what we've been seeing is that from relative to the global temperatures, so the overall global temperature rise is 1.2, that Africa seems to be getting twice the global average, which is just bad luck. And of course, we have many of the most vulnerable people, so it's really, really scary for us. This is some of my own work. In the last 20 years, I've carried on measuring those trees, and I've seen massive dieback in the hotter areas up in Namibia and Northern Cape. And working for South African national parks with them. UCT fire was one that happened on a crazy hot, dry heat wave day. It would never normally have happened. Strong winds. Flooding at Kruger washes away the roads. This was at Tsitsikamma, where there was a big storm surge coming through and washed away the houses. And these are just things we've seen, big droughts and bush encroachment. And this one was actually during COVID. It's Cape Nature Reserve, where people lost their jobs and suddenly had a lot of people unemployed, which I guess is a little prediction of the future. And they couldn't pay the rent, so they moved into new areas around the Cape Flats, and they were nature reserves with threatened species on them. And the police moved them out, but there was no will. They just, of course, came back. What else could they do? And there was a real challenge of conservation versus people's livelihoods. People are there. That area is gone for nature. That butterflies' breeding ground is gone. It's just a tough situation. It's not a right and wrong. And lastly, in terms of climate change, of course, it has big impacts on people, and people have big impacts on nature. And this is changes in agricultural yields. And we in South Africa are badly off, but our neighbors north of us have an even rougher time. And of course, populations keep growing, populations get mobile, there's big immigration issues in Europe, but the same for us. So it's not just obviously an environmental and nature problem, it's very much a human problem. So I leave you with this thought. What is it that we want to conserve? What is it? We talked about some of the places that we loved. Some of us love particular species. Some of us just love like savanna landscape. Sometimes I just love going for a swim in a clean river, an ecosystem service. There's lots of those. In the past, what we used to do is take a fence and put it around a piece of wildland or manage it with local people. And we'd say, right, if we try and minimize the human impact on this, we're doing well. But now with climate change, there's no way you keep it out of your protected area. There's no way you can protect nature from climate change. So you've got to make some difficult decisions. It really pushes what is it that we're wanting to conserve. So sometimes you could say, okay, now I want the most number of species. That's what I'm aiming for. Or you might say, no, what's important is the services it gives people. Or you might say, no, not all species are equal. We want to keep the elephants. We want to keep the panda. We want the cool, cute ones. Those ones are the ones we love. Springboks mustn't go. Proteas mustn't go. They're important. But some of those little plants that are like hundreds of them, so what? Or you might say, listen, I actually don't even care. What I want is wilderness. I want a wild space and to feel that wildness and no one to bother me and no roads. I just want that. And I don't mind if it changes. That's what's important. Or you might say, listen, remember what decisions we're making now are for the generations, dozens of generations beyond us and all these other species that are, into the future. We're changing the world absolutely hugely. In the geological history of the world, we're now in a human-dominated time. So these decisions we make are for everybody beyond us. So maybe what we're trying to do is maximize the evolutionary potential, the ability of nature to basically bounce back probably after we've gone. And all of these different things you might want to choose to do. And they sometimes mean doing very different things. So which species you might let go, which ones where you're going to put your resources. So I think it just leaves us with an interesting question of asking ourselves, what is conservation really about? What is it for? We all have these different values and nobody's agreed. No UN discussions. on what is it that we're trying to do here. So conservation is in a bit of a crisis. Yeah, and we don't even know who should be deciding. Who gets to decide for the people of the future what remains for them? How do we set that up? Do we set up a council of youth? I think something like that. Representatives of the elders, representatives from which cultures? It becomes a very interesting question as to how we curate the nature of the future and allow future generations to feel like we do. Yeah. Right. So I am going to stop there. And I guess we move on to the other speakers and questions at the end. Yeah. Great.
A round of applause, please. Professor Foreign, thank you very much. I believe that was a very enlightening presentation. And there's just a lot of talking points that one can draw from that. But in particular, I really like your approach and how you began in showing us everyone and demonstrating how intertwined we are with the environment as people. So I think that's a very important starting point so that we see that, conservation of the environment is not something very abstract that is outside of us. Because if we speak about the environmental protection bills, a lot of people just get threatened or intimidated by that kind of a language. But once you start asking questions like, what is your favorite place in nature? And then when we come back to the question of what are we aiming to preserve, what are we aiming to conserve, now somebody knows what, I have to protect that by all means necessary. Again, thank you so much for that presentation. I do believe that we'll come back to a lot of issues that you raised during the engagement questions and answer session. But at this point, allow me to invite Mr. Knowledge Mabena. Just a second here. All right. Mr. Mabena is a Zimbabwean academic and has recently completed his MA with ACMS. His MA research investigated strategies through which migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees access justice in Johannesburg, South Africa. His research interest includes migration governance, identity politics, decolonization of knowledge, politics of bordering, public health, education, cultural institutions, and knowledge production. Knowledge is currently a PhD candidate in sociology research at the University of Johannesburg. So his research thematically focuses on conservation areas, the politics of bordering, and borderlands. Mr. Mabena, please join me.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Professor Wendy, for the brilliant presentation. And so this is part of my PhD research presentation. I'm currently working on my proposal, and so my research focuses on the politics of trans-frontier conservation areas and the politics of bordering or rebordering. Okay, this is because the creation of trans-frontier conservation areas, it three different aims, of which I'm going to venture into just after the introduction. And so I'm also looking at how borderland communities actually negotiate this liminality created by trans-frontier conservation areas through spatial practices or spatial production in Mapungubwe, right? And so as a way of introduction, we will then build up on Dr. Professor on this presentation to note that conservation long time ago was conducted through reserves and national parks, and so the process was through fence and fines. So because these reserves and national parks were in situ, like the conservation was done in situ, which means there was no involvement of the community. It didn't affect the community at all. Yet the conservation was actually happening within the confines of that particular community. So there was no integration of these conservation processes, right? And so because of the criticisms levels against these approaches to conservation, there's quite a need for a much more nuanced approach to conservation, of which such criticisms involved like overpopulation of wildlife. For example, if you remember the great Limpopo Transfrontier Conservation area with the number of elephants there, which could not be contained in the reserves, okay, of that particular of the particular parks within that particular area, okay. And so it is such approaches or thoughts that actually led to the birth of transfrontier conservation areas as a way of as an alternative way to see to conservation, right? And so in recent years, maybe in 2 decades or 3, we begin to see the growth of these transfrontier conservation areas because they actually promote conservation that involves the community, okay? And so the transfrontier conservation area, in their nature, they actually struggle or they cut across 2 countries, 2 or more countries. And so my focus of the focus of my research is in Mapungukwe, and Mapungukwe crosses South Africa and then links to Zimbabwe and then Botswana, right? And it's interesting to see why this is so, why the growth of transfrontier conservation areas has been necessary. And according to the Peace Foundation, Peace Parks Foundation, which is, I think, one of the greatest NGOs that actually heralded and pushed for the production or the creation of transfrontier conservation areas. So the concept of conservation areas, according to the Peace Parks Foundation of 2013, it says it acknowledges that sustainable wildlife conservation extends beyond protected areas, okay? Which literally means, I'm sorry, Doc, when I speak, I usually like moving around, so I'm now glued here. I don't like that. And it disciplines me, and I don't like disciplines when I speak. I don't want to be reading like this, so yeah, right? So I think the main, can I move this, Doc? Is it possible to remove it? How do I do it? Okay. Oh, okay, then that's a problem. Okay, so the main aims of creating transfrontier conservation areas has been that they are going to obviously enhance biodiversity management. They are going to enhance environmental conservation. They are also going to contribute to the livelihoods of the communities, right? And economic development, of course. But economic development and the livelihood for the local communities, of course. But I think one that really comes, okay, so the one that really comes out clearly is that because they transcend or they cut across 3 borders, there's a feel of decoloniality. The decoloniality in the sense that animals, wildlife could move between from one country to another, depending on what season it is and what resources those animals, wildlife is looking for, right? Could be water, better grazing land, and all that. So this will then promote natural selection. I mean, from your biology, from your geography, will understand that. So, right? And so where I was, sorry about that. Where was I? Okay, so okay, you can do it for me. Okay, so once we think borderlessness, once we think decolonization, and then we begin to understand that the creation or the establishment of these transfrontier conservation areas is following a liberal approach, right? Where it says, right, we have a borderless society, a borderless world where, you know, investments, information, you know, people will have to travel freely, okay? Right? So once that is done, then people can move freely, animals can move freely, okay? But then what then happens is that I'm sorry to what you did here. I can't see this side, but you can see that side. So I don't know what's happening there. So what happens then is that um, these transfrontier conversation areas then become a marker of different identities or meanings to different people, isn't it? Right? So since they strangely across different borders, isn't it? So my research area, I'll skip that and then speak to what I see. So my research area is in Mapunguke, and Mapunguke strangely is, as I said, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Botswana. And so you can stay on that slide. And so what then it means is that that ancient monument, which is Mapunguke, means a lot to different people, right? And that different actors that are involved in the creation of that were involved are involved in the management and in the creation and management of that transfrontier conservation area. Okay, and so we then notice that to Zimbabwe it means something, right? To Botswana it will mean something. To South Africa it means something. And when I mention these countries, these are states, and we bring in the idea of how do then states govern areas that are said to be peripheral, okay? Because you know the state will obviously, function well within urban areas, and then we begin to feel their control. We begin to understand the rules and regulation within urban areas. But what happens is we go to peripheral areas such as borderlands, and borderlands now that are being shaped by transfrontier conservation areas, okay? So transfrontier conservation areas now then become a way of reproducing borders, okay? In the sense that while you are saying, let's open up for animals, okay? We are not opening up for domestic animals, okay? For people, remember those areas, they are dependent on agriculture, production of food, protection of agricultural animals and all that. So once we say, let's open up for wildlife, okay? We are saying now the wildlife is going to be a predator to domesticated animals, isn't it? We are saying that the people who are living within those areas are now losing their sources of livelihoods, which is most small pieces of land, right? So now they have to relocate to other places. So transfrontier conservation areas become complex in the sense that they are moving people, right? People are forced to relocate. People lose their livelihoods, okay, in the sense that predation is there, in the sense that they have to move to new places, in the sense that, they now have to depend on the smallest pieces of land because they've given up the land for conservation, right? And in terms of movement, it's still a problem because one of the researchers that I spoke to and interviewed towards my proposal says there's a place called Maramani in Mapunguke there. People have to travel when they decide to use formal ways of crossing the border. They have to travel from Maramani to Bedbridge just to cross the border for them to look for work or for them to get to work. So the border is 120 kilometers, right, to Bedbridge, and then 120 kilometers now to the places of work. A place where they can actually walk 15 to 20 minutes in at their workplace, right? So it is the border now that disciplines the people or the communities within the borderlands. Why? Because the state is still there, the presence, because of the security guards who are actually manning, right, the area, right? Militarized security systems. It could be technology, if you want to, right? And this, again, forms a complex issue because it affects the people who are actually experiencing the borderlands, people who are actually living within the borderlands, and the actors who are actually powerful actors who are making these decisions are not considerate of all those issues, okay? And this is where my research question comes in now to say, if these transfrontier conservation areas are causing such liminality, how then do people, because people are not devoid of agents, isn't it? They will practice agents. They will think outside the box, as we usually say, isn't it? To say, how then do I walk from here to my workplace without without traveling and paying money for 120 kilometers? Okay. So what strategies do they use to produce that place? I mean that particular space. So for me, it's about spatial production, right? Besides spatial production, I also look at what kinds of capitals that they're going to be using, right? Social capital, political capital, economic capital, right? To negotiate or live within those places, okay? So it's quite interesting because this is a social science kind of invitation into a much more science-dominated field of conservation, isn't it? So in terms of theory, these are the theories that I'm thinking. So it's kind of a triangulated theoretical framework that's going to give me a thinking tool around how do these people maneuver or move around these conservation areas, right? As we are theme today, as we are focusing on the theme of complexity, right, of the conservation area or of the processes of conservation. How do these people think or in terms of producing space? When I talk about space, let's think of them, Mapungukwe, as a place of worship, okay? How do they really negotiate Mapungukwe as a place of worship? How do they really negotiate Mapungukwe as a place of tourism, right? Do they benefit from that particular economic tourism? No, they don't, because the researcher who has been involved there tells me that in the month of September, which is just coming in a few weeks' time, on the 24th, there's an event there for cycling and all that around Mapungu. And on that day, or in those 2 weeks, is it 2 weeks or a week? There's an informal gate, border gate, that's open for tourists, okay? Tourists can cross without their passport being stamped, isn't it? But locals cannot do that. Do you see the disjuncture of that? You live in an area, a tourist comes, they pay money, but they easily cross without being asked. Not in the formal border process, in the border post, but they just open the fence and then open the gate, cycle there, come back, they can actually cross the Botswana, same process, they cross into Zimbabwe, same process. All right, so these are complex issues, right, that are brought about by conservation. So we're actually saying now, what are the theoretical apparatuses that we can use? What are the theoretical tools that we can use? Okay, so the first of which I'm looking at the spatial production by Lefebvre, 1992. Okay, so Lefebvre actually focused on the spatial production and practices or appropriation of space in urban areas. Okay, but for me, the creation of transfrontier conservation areas is actually a way of paving space for wildlife. Okay, a way of paving space for the growth of conservation, isn't it? For the protection of biodiversity, and yet it doesn't consider the people who live within the borderlands, okay? And then because those people are not devoid of agency, they will obviously come up with a plan to say, we are now producing and appropriating our own space. How then is this space produced in physical terms? How is the space appropriated, perhaps represented, okay? How is the space itself imagined by those people who are living there? Right, to negotiate every day, right, to access the shrine. Remember, the worship, I mean, the burial societies, the burial areas, the graves, and everything. That these are their daily lives, okay? But because Lefebvre is not enough, okay? Because he's not enough while he developed spatial production, he also drew it from Deleuze. Deleuze spoke about temporality of space, where in our everyday life, we negotiate space and use space temporarily depending on time, okay? So there's this space-time relationship that's always there, be it in the afternoon. That is why when you go to Johannesburg in the afternoon, there are a lot of people actually selling their fruits and everything. But when you go back in the evening, just to loosen up, there's someone there, there's sex workers, they say wherever, in the same space where someone is selling fruits, in the evening, there are sex workers working in that particular area, okay? So these are examples of, such an example of our spatio-temporality. And then I move on to Foucault. Foucault is kind of a person who speaks about discipline a lot, right? And here I draw from his theory of governmentality to say, while people are governed by the state, right? How do they develop localized processes or localized strategies of governing themselves, isn't it? Through chiefs, through village heads, through, of course, church leaders and other community groups that might be there in terms of governing, isn't it? Right? We again saw, as I read through my literature, we see how there's this vigilante group growing there in terms of cattle thieving, isn't it? These people believe they actually depend on their cattle for survival. And the thieves who actually they're stealing their cattle. And then we begin to see a vigilante group that acts as a security for, looking after the cattle. But obviously they do more than that, isn't it? So the issue of governmentality is important there. I then move on to use Puto, like in the sense that he thinks about in the frame of the theory of practice, right? That every day we live in fields. It could be fields of education, fields of policing, fields of law. But in every field, there's a habitus, okay? There are different social fields. These are capital, could be capital fields, all right? Capital or social fields, right? Could be political fields, economic fields, etc., right? So for me, I chose the social field in the sense that I'm looking at the social capital, because what happens in Mapungoko is that the other side of Zimbabwe is largely vendor-speaking people. We're actually related to vendor-speaking people on the other side of South Africa, which forms a great corpus of social networking within that particular area. Okay, so it's quite interesting to see how then they visit there. Do they have to go to the border to then visit a neighbor who's their auntie across the fence, isn't it? So that's how I'm looking forward to use those theories as my thinking tool. So in terms of methodology, the literature, much of the literature that I've consulted shows that, particularly from history, people depend on oral histories. And most of the people or researchers that go there, they will write and say, we collected oral data or oral histories. I don't think you can collect oral histories, can you? I don't think you can do so, because those are specialized and localized forms of knowledge, right, that we cannot collect, but instead we need to negotiate them, isn't it? So here, for this research, I'm proposing to adopt a participatory action research. In this sense, I'm going to co-create knowledge with the communities. So I'm not going to be only asking questions, but I will involve the communities, the borderline communities, to give me that particular knowledge, to say, who used to be here? How did Mapungoko come by? Okay, how did the fencing, the transfrontier conservation areas come by? Okay, so I'm not even going to develop a questionnaire for this. I will actually have the community participating, being involved in the development of the instrument to develop, to gather these histories of that particular information of that particular area. Okay, so critical realism will be an undergetting paradigm, because it says ontologically, reality, right, is shaped by our everyday experiences, isn't it? And then so is knowledge, because knowledge is also subjective. So this is why I chose that particular area. So in so doing, I think I'm adopting kind of a decolonial approach to research, which of course is going to take time for me to understand and to conduct. But I think it's going to be more important and valuable for my research. So in terms of conclusion, perhaps let's think about ethics. I mean, this is what I'm planning to also push in my research, to say in conservation, we need to think about ethical conservation, right? Conservation that, Prof has actually said that there are actually instruments that are being developed, and it's new. Thank you so much for that information, Prof. That there are actually instruments that are being developed by the state to say, if then we are to benefit the communities in this conservation, it's going to be more economical for them, and I feel it's more ethical. So for me, conservation should be ethical, okay? Right. So on that note, I end here. So thank you so much.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Mr. Mabena. So in the interest of time, allow me to quickly move on to Professor Walter Musagwa, who is a professor in the Department of Geography, Environmental Management, and Energy Studies in the Faculty of Science here at the University of Johannesburg. Professor, please.
All right, thank you very much. So I just want us to agree on one thing. Why do we conserve? Linking conservation and sustainable development. Can I have three volunteers? Three volunteers who want to speak about their shopping preferences. Yeah, shopping, like where you shop clothes and why. Briefly. One, 2, 3. Okay, can you tell me where you shop and why? Particularly for clothes. Yes. So you like Shane and Cotton On. And there's a big pop-up Shane at the Mall of Africa, and I see people queuing there. And then I look at Jet and Mr. Price. They were, I mean, people are not queuing, but at Shane, the queue was quite big. Yes? So H&M, right? And Mr. Price, based on the quality and the price. Yes? That's a very good response. So you can see we all have got different preferences, right? Thrifting, Mr. Price, H&M, Shane. So we can't agree where to shop, right? But we are told to agree on sustainable development, right? Conservation for today, so that we can meet the needs of the future, right? That's what we are told. That's why we conserve. And in our classes, we have been taught those three circles. There's the environment, the society, and the economy, right? In between, that's where we find sustainable development. But I'm saying no to that, because why? It doesn't work. Without the environment, there's no economy, there's no society. Without the environment, I can't be talking here. It's because of the environment why I'm here. Hence, it's useful to conserve it. I've eaten my lunch at home. Where's the lunch coming from? From the environment. The fact that I'm breathing or giving this lecture, right, is because there is oxygen. And that is for free. So the environment is critical. So we've all been to a wedding, right? You know how a wedding cake looks like. So I'm shifting this. So before, we are told there's the environment, the economy, and the society. And then there is sustainable development. But I'm saying no to that. What I'm saying is sustainable development is a wedding cake. So in that wedding cake, you know, there are layers. There's the first layer, the second layer, and the third layer. If we remove the first layer, what happens? It will fall, right? And guess what is the first layer? The environment, right? So the environment is the first layer. It anchors everything. Without the environment, there's no economy, there's no society, there's no people. So I just want us to agree that yes, there's need to conserve, but we are conserving it so that we can survive, so that there is the society, there is the economy. Without the environment, there's nothing. I think we saw from the slides in terms of climate change, the pollution, all that it impacts our well-being. My colleagues talked about ecosystem services or why we conserve. So I'll just touch a bit on that. So we have also moved away from ecosystem services, but we are now calling them NCPs, nature's contribution to people. Hence, it's crucial to conserve the environment, the vegetation, the wildlife. So there are 3 NCPs, and they are quite complex, so to speak. So does anyone eat mopane worms or masonja? So I hear it's a resounding yes, right? So why do you eat them? It tastes nice, right? What else? What else? It's also cultural, right? So when you eat masonja or mopane worms, right, it's cultural. So we are conserving this environment so that it contributes several items or several things to us as human beings. And there are 3 to 4 things that the environment contributes to us. The first one is provisional services. What are these provisional services? These are the goods and services that you and I get from nature, like air, food, timber, all those natural products that we use. There are also cultural services. My previous speakers, they have talked about the link to nature, that we are linked or we are connected to nature. So I remember one day I was in the national park and the security manager had just caught a pangolin. And he said, do you just want to come and have a look? And obviously I was interested. Why? Because pangolins give good luck. They give good luck or they give good charms. And then I went to the security manager and then I picked up the pangolin and I held the pangolin like a baby. And I was with my PhD student. She also took that pangolin and she held it, like a baby. So that shows the connection to nature. And guess what happened the next day? I'd never seen a rhino in the wild, right? And then on that day, I saw 5. When we were going out of the park to the communities, we saw 3. And then when we were coming back, we saw 2. So we obviously linked it to that rhino. But a few days later, our luck ran out because somewhere we were stuck in the national park when we were crossing a riverbed. So maybe perhaps we were supposed to go and touch that rhino again. So in traditional African culture, we all relate to animals. You have totems or clan names. I remember driving in Kruger National Park with a fellow with a surname called Ndlovu. So it was his first time to see an elephant. And it was so amazing. He could not stop watching and he wanted to go quite near. And I was like, no, you don't do that. Because what if this elephant, budges to us and then it bumps this car? We won't have transport. But to him, it was his first time seeing an elephant in the wild. Perhaps maybe you might have seen it in the zoo. So you see that connection to nature. So myself, my clan name is an otter. What's the other English name? African clawless otter. So I'm doing research on that. It's an elusive animal, so to speak. I've never seen it in real life, but only through the camera traps that we put because it's elusive. Why did I do that research? Because that's my clan name, that's my totem. So you just hear that this African clawless otter, it exists in the river system, but I've never seen it. It's elusive. I've only seen it through camera traps. I've only seen the footprints. So the footprints, you can literally see that they don't have any claws. So there's this connection or there's this link to nature. So I'm also going to try and wrap up from what my colleagues had said. So my colleagues, they talked about fortress conservation. This is conservation where you put the fence, the communities, they are removed, just like the establishment of Kruger National Park, Masai Mara, and all those other national parks in Africa. Why are we doing this? We are doing this for biodiversity conservation, and it's also a global good. My colleagues talked about these animals. We own these animals, right? But the question is, do we own them? We only own them when things are nice, right? But when things are bad, we don't own them. So for example, an elephant, right? We only own it if it is bringing income, tourists, and we are benefiting. But when it comes to human-wildlife conflict, that elephant now belongs to Kruger National Park. Do you see the conflict? Yes, it's our animals, right? But when there are problems, it's no longer ours. It's Kruger National Park. Why? It's because of the history of how conservation was, or these parks were established. There's also the issue of keystone species. What are these keystone species? The rhinos, right? Elephants and lions. People like these keystone species. But the communities, I was asking the people at Masisi village, just adjacent to Kruger National Park, their feeling when I was talking to them, they were like, we are worse off when we compare ourselves to the rhinos or to the elephants. The rhinos and the elephants, they've got veterinary doctors, so to speak. They've got all they need. But I don't have money for food. I can't survive. I don't have a job. But I see 4x4 cars coming in this park, and then they just buy wood for, for drying within the park. And these people, they are chopping down the mopane trees so that they can sell to the tourists. So I could feel that there's this sort of disenfranchisement, particularly with the national park or with these parks, because people feel that conservation is not for them. Conservation is for tourists, conservation is for the rich, conservation is for those that are educated. And for some, they've never set foot in the park. And they're also complaining that when they poach, right, they are now called poachers. But we are saying these animals, they belong to us. So these people, I don't necessarily feel that they are bad, because why are they poaching? Because of hunger. As a father, I would not want to watch my kids go hungry. So obviously, I would also go in that park to poach the springbok, the kudu, the buffalo, so that my children have some food. I don't think that would make me a bad person. But this issue of subsistence poaching is quite a big issue. Of course, there's the issue of organized crime in terms of killing elephants and also rhinos. So this moves us to the next form of conservation, community-based conservation, which my colleagues talked about. This is conservation with the people, for the people, where you come together to devise these plans or these conservation plans. And I think this has started recently in South Africa. If you look at Kruger National Park, the northern part, does anyone know about the Makuleke concession? So the Makuleke clan, they were evicted from the park, the northern section, when Kruger was established. So now they are running that concession together with the national parks. But I really don't know whether they are benefiting much, or it's just about ticking boxes just to say that there is a concession. And this concession is also controversial, because that land, they were the vendor-speaking people before the establishment of the park. And then there was a war between the vendors and the Tsongas. And then the vendors won that war and they settled in there. But then now when this concession was filed, the Tsongas said, we are the original people, we are removed from this area. So we should be the ones benefiting. And likewise, they benefited. So the question is, does living close to a national park pay? Does proximity pay? We have just submitted a journal article looking at this. So proximity or living close to a national park only pays if there is beneficiation, particularly to the community. People are looking at jobs or coming up with tourism ventures, because it is those communities that live next to the national park that are bearing the brunt of conservation, like human-wildlife conflict. I took my student for field work, and we were doing human-wildlife conflict, and we were speaking to the farmers, and we saw some elephants like 100 meters away. It was very nice saying, oh, we are now seeing it in real life. But 5 minutes later, things turned southwards. Why? The elephants were chasing us now. So the satchels were flying, we were busy running, we were not now taking the videos, this like that, because it was one man for himself. It was about conservation. So I even left some of my devices and I went and picked them up later. So the question is, who are we conserving this land, and does proximity pay? So what should we do? So in conclusion, I think conservation should involve the community more, and the community, they're more interested in beneficiation of the conservation of that particular resource, be it the lion, the elephant, the rhinos. they're concerned about beneficiation. It should not be about the fortress conservation, but conserving with the community. And we can only do this if there is partnership between these two, the technocrats or the park and the community. And the other thing, we should conserve sustainably. Yes, there's hunting. I'm sure you know about hunting, killing of elephants and so forth. So that form of tourism is not sustainable because somebody else is conserving these rhinos, these elephants, and these lions, right? And then hunters just come and kill. I was looking at a hunting package. It was like almost close to like 300 to 400,000 rand, and I was like, who can afford that actually? Obviously, it could be rich tourists. I can't afford, I mean, a package of 300,000 just to go and kill perhaps a buffalo. Of course, it includes maybe the flights, the accommodation, all inclusive. But that is not sustainable. There's little to no beneficiation. So in conclusion, conservation should be about the people, for the people, so that there is beneficiation. There are many ways of benefiting. Yes, we get clean air, clothes, natural resources, and jobs. So conservation should be about beneficiation, particularly for the community. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor Musogwe. Yeah, another lot of talking points from your presentation. And of course, while we say here may be open to a lot of interpretations, I'm pretty sure it did not mean to, I know people do this poaching and hunting for different reasons, but I'm pretty sure it did not mean to endorse poaching. So we do not endorse this by any means. Yeah, it's illegal and it's a crime, so don't poach. I think at this point, I would like to open the floor for the questions and answers. Just by show of hands, and then we will recognize you. Those who are joining us online, you're just going to use the raise hand function or use the Q&A function to then raise a question. We will read it out. So by show of hands, please, if you have any question. 1, 2, 3. Do we have anyone online? Okay, can you go in that order? 1, 2, 3 at the back. Please go ahead.
Hi. I wanted to ask to like specifically here, 'cause you did mention that a professor. Oh, then okay, because she did mention that some countries did not sign like for the, but the yeah, except for some countries. So I wanted to ask, how does international law protect conservation, and why is it not working? Because other countries do sign, but they do not comply. Like the dangers to the ecosystem, they're still like increasing. Yeah.
Good afternoon. My question is based on Prof. Masagwa. The question is, when it comes to poaching and the country owning the animals and the wildlife in it, where do we draw the line, or where do we begin? Because, for example, in the rural areas, most of the wild places they are not protected. So anybody just goes there, doesn't require a license to be a hunter or whatever, but they just leave their houses, take their dogs and their weapons needed, and they go to the wild and come back with animals, right? So like with that thing, like how is it, where do we draw the line, or where do we set up a limit to put it? Now, this is poaching. It's not allowed in this sector. Yeah, thank you.
Hi. My question is for all the speakers, really, because I feel that they touched on my question that I actually came with beforehand. So it has to do with African countries and how they can balance the need for economic growth while trying to be conservative in the context of the fact that you need to take into consideration the colonial history of Africa. And I've had conversations with peers where they say that African countries are expected to be conservative now, and it limits their ability to industrialize and grow their economies. And you find that countries in the West, like we saw that the Industrial Revolution was the start of the whole climate change graph going up. So how is it that there is now a major push for, so how can African countries balance their need to grow their economies while being conservative?
Thank you so much. For Dr. Wendy, I'm wondering when you are presenting the revision for UN conventions, different conventions, is there anyone adding article condemning the state when they're using violence against community in this conversation, or just it is for animals and natural resources as without state community relation? And for Dr. Walter and Dr. Knowledge, from your experience, have you met anyone from this authentic or indigenous community who are enrolled in education and enrolled in science? Because the power of science is coming that we can talk and making graphs and all of this part, but on the ground, that's why they don't include people in the conservation or whatever grassroots community. So have you met anyone who enrolled and you have a common language and common graphs and common understand your statistics and all of this stuff, or it is literally a different two worlds between science and community? Thank you.
Excellent. I would like to start with you, Knowledge, to respond to the questions, but I'd like to invite you back here for the benefit of those who are online. Unless you're comfortable there, I can give you the roving mic.
Okay. I'll speak it. Okay, I'll start with your question. Sorry, I don't know your name. I didn't hear your name. No? I mean, so yeah, I will start with your question. So I think Prof will finish off. But I think conservation is, particularly in Southern Africa or in Africa as well, it's a colonial project, okay? So we cannot really do away with the coloniality of conservation, because initially when it started with these big guns, right, big guys who really had money, and when they did the conservation, it was more of a pastime thing, okay, to protect and attract capital from other countries and all that. So it was purely for a specific class, okay. It is then that we see its metamorphosis, or moving from one stage to another up to what we see today. And this is why I mentioned decolonization, right? Decoloniality, in the sense that whatever the trans-frontier conservation areas are justified, however they're justified, as peace parks, whatever. But let me just use the peace parks. Whose peace are they protecting there? Okay, when they are, people who are moved from their areas of original inhabitants, isn't it? Right. I hope my research is my response is okay. They are okay with it. Then right there at the back, honestly, I mean, people that I've actually interviewed so far for this proposal, the outcry I mean, the main point that they raise is that in the creation of these trans-frontier conservation areas, there hasn't been any consultation with the community, right? So this is why we are saying that trans-frontier conservation areas, they're actually masking the processes of bordering because there's no written down consultation forums or meetings that have been conducted. So even if they're there, they're actually masking the actual processes of powerful actors, all right, who are actually saying, let's do this, we are going to benefit, and then they pick up just a few powerful individuals within the community, your chiefs, your community leaders, and all that. And the other thing with this, we lack conservation language in the rural areas, okay? In those areas. Language that says, you know, this is conservation. What does conservation mean in my own language, right? So we need to come up with such strategies to, right, promote indigenous language in order to come up with at least tapping into the indigenous knowledge systems of conservation, right? And then maybe I know Prof is going to respond to your rural areas and the issue of hunting. There are laws that actually cut that, but there's no visibility of the law or of the security forces looking after that. All right, so this is why when they see you with these big dogs, what the greyhounds, okay, the police can stop you in the rural areas and ask you what is it that we're doing. This is why hunting it happens a lot in the night or right in the morning, early morning of the hours in those areas before the police become visible and all that. I hope I answered everyone. I think Prof will.
Excellent. We may have a chance for follow-ups if you did not satisfy the questions. Professor Musago, I'd like to invite you.
These were tough questions, but I'll start with the one on indigenous knowledge and community and, this thing about science and graphs. So what we have done in the past 7 years, it's empowering. The communities have knowledge. So I've worked with the Masisi community just next to Pafuri Gate to Kruger National Park. They just saw us coming in and out. And then one day they asked me, please, can you teach us some of these things, this research that you are doing? And I organized a workshop with some colleagues from Austria. It was a 5-day workshop where we were training and teaching that vendor community. So it was more about learning from them. So we were asking them the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats within their society. And they were telling us all this information. And we were training them to package this information so that they can talk to their local municipality, Kruger National Park. And I'm glad to say, to this date, that community is now empowered. It actually challenges Kruger National Park, the municipality, the national government, because they are empowered. They have posters that they have showing the SWOT. So we now actually go almost every year to that community. But what we did, it was listening to their knowledge or their local systems. And this also speaks to the issue of poaching. In this Masisi village, they are small little villages, and obviously they are governed traditionally. So one village is very good at conserving their resources. Why? Because they've got a clued up traditional leader. The other villages, the traditional leaders, they are only concerned about maybe if you come in the area, are you going to buy them whiskey or beer, or are you going to give them money, right? But the other one is more clued up about their area. And poaching is not allowed. You're not even allowed to cut down trees indiscriminately. So you have situations where people from village A now try and go and poach in village X. But when they arrive at village X, the community there, they are the policemen because they know how to conserve. On another note, indigenous knowledge has always been there, particularly on conservation. So here I'm speaking about the Tsonga-speaking community. I was taken to a pan called Manyanda Pan. What happened at that pan? the traditional leaders used to come there during the hunting season, and the leaders would give a hunting quota to various families. So maybe you are told, hunt 2 springboks, hunt 2 kudus. And this happened before the establishment of Kruger National Park, Limpopo National Park, Gonarejo National Park, or even Mapungubwe National Park. So this knowledge has always existed. It's just that it's not captured, it's not documented. So when I was taken to this pan, it was amazing that it used to happen. And fortunately, the people who were evicted from, to make way for the park, they are still alive, but they are about to die, so to speak. Yeah, because I mean, they're old. So, we did a project to try and go and visit these old people who have got experience of how particularly these transfrontier parks were established. So the question of poaching, I think traditional leadership should be involved. They should control the resources. If they are not involved, maybe perhaps now we need the police. But that's something else. But I believe in local management, the traditional leaders themselves, to control this hunting or poaching. Because if you continuously hunt and poach, there will be no resource to poach or hunt in the next 10 or so years. So local leadership is always crucial. So I also give an example of 2 Tsonga communities. One is in the north, one is in the south. The south is more clued up. Why? Because they've accepted that, yes, there was colonialism, but how do we benefit from this conservation? So they come together to form partnership with these parks so that they benefit. The one in the north, they are still, saying, we were chased away. We actually want to come back in the park and stay where our ancestors used to stay. So they are still poor off because they are not benefiting, because they are not coming to the table, so to speak, because I can say there's money to be made in conservation, but you just need to come to the table so that you partner with the authorities, with the government departments, just like the Makuleke community. So the projects that are happening to the Tsonga community in the south, they are massive. Personally, I can't even dream of them, like aquaponics projects. I can't even afford them. But why is that happening? Because they are partnering. So partnerships, it's something that is also crucial. Thank you.
Thank you. An interesting set of questions, and great to hear your perspectives on things, and of course our other 2 speakers. I'm going to hop in first with the question of the UN engagements and the people versus nature, and actually I think speak a little to Prof. Walter's reference to the Kruger National Park, and just to understand the challenges and how it's not a kind of cut and dried issue. There are 2.3 million people who live on the border within 20 kilometers of Kruger, and how very challenging it is to let everybody benefit from that park. There are a total of 30,000 buffalo. So, I mean, and 22,000 elephants. It's like, even if you divided it up, you couldn't even give each family one animal to eat, and then that's over, right? No more tourists. So it's tricky to balance how you do it. I know that with Kruger National Park, for example, they have set up people and other parks who live around the parks as wildlife farmers if they have the right land and they capacitate them. There's compensation paid if an animal comes and damages your crops or your livestock. Some of the concessions, like the Malaleki one, are owned by, they were given back to the people, and it needs to be run as a national park, but the park leases it effectively from the Malalekis, and they are engaged in it. So there are a lot of efforts that are ongoing, But it's this huge challenge, A, to redress the problems of the past where people were dispossessed of their land, and that remains an injustice that is difficult to redress. So yeah, that's what South Africa is grappling with. That's what our new Biodiversity Act tries to deal with. Some of our national parks, there's still people living in them. The new model is that people can stay, and it's just agreements about how you manage. So yeah, watch this space, and we're all just trying to get in there and do the right thing, whatever that is. The balance of development and environmental goals is certainly very challenging, particularly as a developing country. I mean, in some ways, we benefit from not being in the front. So, for example, think about cell phones. We got to leapfrog phone lines to most people, and now everybody is in contact without having to have, that whole thing about a telephone line is redundant. We didn't need to go there. So that was great. But in things like climate change and the emissions, it's absolutely true. Our economies and our industry is now going to be retarded if we land up not being able to actually burn the coal that we have on hand. So what do? It's not fair. Our new minister has come in and said, absolutely, climate change is on the agenda, but we are a developing country and we cannot do what everybody else does. And so the developed countries, there's this tension, and that's what's actually derailed for 15 years the climate change negotiations, because China was classified as developing and US as developed. And so US would not sign because they said China's going to get trade benefits from this that we won't, because it's much more stringent for developing countries. So what happened? The whole world suffered with another 15 years of full-on emissions by everybody. So who won? I think everybody lost in that case. But what about South Africa? It's very tricky. What do we do? It's again an injustice and a complex system. And it comes back, I think, to that question of why are the UN conventions not working? Why are we not winning this battle? If you look at the UN sustainability goals around people, just the same. We keep missing those targets by a mile. We're not even bending those curves of decline. Why is that happening? Why? Yeah. What is going on? I mean, there was that movie about the inconvenient truth, and I think that's maybe talks a little about it, and as to why we as humans keep on going and doing the same thing as if nothing is going to change, as if it can be just business as usual. So that's where I think I'm going to stop in answering questions. There may be more, but it's also a good segue into a last little conclusion to the session. Are there more questions?
Sanbonani. So I want to ask, not really ask though, but okay, we have these topics of conservation, sustainable, and climate change. These are the current topics, like the trending topic nowadays. But then my question now is, do people in remote areas are really receiving the information they should in a way that is understandable to them? Like going back to Prof. Musakwa, talking about poaching. If I go back to my village and talk about poaching and tell them about poaching, they will tell me that they don't know what that is, because they excuse me, they poach, if I use the word, for a living. From back in the days till today, they do. And also to the sociologist, he talked about an event that's going to happen on the 24th of September. If I'm not mistaken, that's the exact date where they will open the border gate. Not really the border gate, but in that particular time frame. Okay. Now, to the event organizer, I don't know if you are one of them. But I want to understand, how will they make sure that this event is successful in a way that they want it to be, looking at the context of xenophobia in South Africa, undocumented foreigners and stuff, even though they say they are documented, but now we have to keep statistics of who is in the country.
I think we have time for only one question. So if you can just please quickly address that so that we will adjourn. We're already racing against the clock. Please go ahead.
Okay, so on the one about information to people in remote areas, I mean, I think there are some areas where it's completely fine to poach. I mean, it's not poaching, it's hunting. What am I saying? In tribal areas under tribal authorities, it remains the as it was at the discretion of the chief. In protected areas, national parks, no hunting. But in some cases, one can collect resources like Mopani worms. Those are programs, thatching. They're regulated. Firewood, those are allowed. And then there's certain species you can never hunt, like rhino. And then others where it's fine, and if it's on private land. So it's not black and white. And as you say, it's not always easy to know. But yeah, in tribal lands, it remains as it was. Yeah.
I think Prof. Nsako touched on something, although not directly. I think when you look at these areas and issues of conservation, you should understand that perhaps the world is not uniform, okay? Even our country is not uniform. So what's happening now in Masisi is not happening in Mapungoko, isn't it? It's not happening in other trans-frontier conservation areas, right? Kalahati area and all that. So these areas are not uniform. So we then need to understand that our ideas of governmentality or our ideas of leadership will always be different. Our approaches to leadership will always be different. So I think I hope I've answered.
Yeah, let me just wrap up, particularly this issue of poaching. I'm not sure why I mentioned it, but poaching, I think it's a scientific or it's a technical term. You're hunting or killing what is not yours. And I'm not a policy expert or government expert, as it were, but my point is killing animals indiscriminately, I don't think it's sustainable in the future, because we need to conserve this resource so that the community benefits from that resource. That's why these animals need to be kept for photographic tourism. Yes, there are management systems where hunting quotas are set, but these are set perhaps in certain conservancies, but I'm not too sure in communal areas. But if you look at provinces like KZN, there's the Ingonyama Trust who manages these natural resources. But the key thing is it's being managed by traditional leadership, and they set the rules and guideline. So they might not use the word poaching, but they might say, no, you are not allowed to kill the animals because we won't benefit. So the Ingonyama Trust is a classic example of indigenous management of local resources, particularly wildlife. And of course, you can't kill lions and all those other keystone species, so to speak. Thank you.
Fantastic. A round of applause, please. Yeah, it was really excellent. I mean, we can never have enough time to discuss these issues. They are very important to all of us. I really would like to thank the speakers today for a very, very enlightening and eye-opening discussion. Professor Wendy, thank you so much. Mr. Mabena, thank you so much, sir. Professor Walter Osawa, thank you so much. And I'd also like to thank all of you for being part of this conversation today. We hope that you, as you leave here, we are going to be sharing all of the information that you've learned with your immediate networks, because of course we've learned how important it is to protect the environment, again, because of how intertwined it is we are with us as human beings. I mean, Mr. Mabena spoke about how he himself is part of nature, so you do want to protect that. So we do hope that you will share that with your immediate networks. And of course, just to ease this conversation around these issues, again, we'll go back to the issue of how, if we speak about these very big concepts, you know, a lot of people get threatened, you know, especially those of us in society who are illiterate, some of those people. If you speak about this kind of language, it can be very threatening and intimidating to a lot of people. But want to start speaking in a manner that, you know, you are enlightening a person that everything that you do every day is part of nature. Whatever you're doing, the food that you eat, everything that you do is part of nature. So you should do everything humanly possible to then protect that. I would like to thank the IPATC team behind the scenes, the organizing team led by Ms. Ratizo. Mugombe, very instrumental. Reshika, who unfortunately could not be with us today, who's feeling very ill, but very instrumental in making all of this possible. And we have Dr. Klaba, who I believe is still with us online. He's verified, he's in Lesotho, so could not be here physically. And of course, I want to thank our director, Professor Spamandla Zondi at the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, who gave us a go-ahead to execute this project. A round of applause, please, for our speakers. And a huge one for yourselves. Yeah, that brings to the end our conversation for today. But please do stick around as we have lunch just outside here. And the conversation continues. The speakers, I believe they are sticking around so we can continue to engage as we have lunch outside. Thank you so much. We are Jen.